Hello, welcome to another book report. Have a pretty good one here. I found it quite fascinating. There we go. Should have practiced this, I guess. Red Roulette, an insider's story of wealth, power, corruption, and vengeance in today's China by Desmond Shum. Um, I I think I don't know. I wouldn't quite call it a must read, but I would strongly encourage anyone who is interested in China, uh, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the CCP, East Asia, or really the world at all. It's a fascinating window into a very interesting period of China's economic growth and political development. Um, I did search Desmond Shum for character references briefly. I didn't dig very much. I couldn't find anything, but just based on his writing, the content, and the videos I've seen, um, I know it's hard to judge somebody by their face and their facial expressions, but he seems like a fairly straight shooter. Um, and frankly, I like him. He reveals this is very autobiographical, and I like him. I just do. And my intuition is that he's a relatively. I mean, everybody has a few blind spots and whatever, but in general, he's trying to be as honest and open as he can be. I think, except in a couple areas for reasons that I understand. I mean, his ex-wife is still in China and still a prisoner. Although, when this book was released, she had not been heard from, but he did get a phone call last year. I think late last year. I forget the exact date. I want to say like September or October. He did get a couple phone calls from her, so she is alive, but clearly being coerced by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and she she basically said, "Don't publish the book," even though it had already been in bookstores, and she gave veiled threat. Well, not so veiled threats, like people, somebody might die if you. She didn't say who, but and like what would anyway. She conveyed threats, which clearly were coerced, or almost certainly coerced. Um, but anyway, as of late last year, she was still alive. But she had been missing for like 3 years, I think, at that point. Anyway, a fascinating window. He was active economically in China through the 90s, 2000s, and then didn't leave until I think 2016, something like that. 2017, something like that. So, fascinating window. And no big surprises, but the details are just uh, themselves somewhat revealing, I think, and uh, uh, important, I think. Anyway, so he's talking about the early 2000s here. This was a wild time in China, with government bureaus vying with one another for land, resources, and licenses, all of which, given China's breakneck growth, meant money. Competing state owned phone companies ripped out one another's lines, even though technically they were all owned by the state. Bureaucrats deployed thugs to battle other thugs over the rights to develop property. Rival bus manufacturers sent gangs across provincial lines to kidnap their foes. It was no secret that Shunyi's district government hated the neighboring airport. Well, now he's getting into details about a project he was working on. But that's fascinating. I mean, I'm not surprised, but I had no idea that rival phone companies would actually destroy infrastructure of other companies just to get ahead. Uh, just, just fascinating. Um, yeah, and then the level of bureaucracy and corruption, which again, I'm not surprised, but the details of it and the layers of it. I mean, he talks about having to get literally hundreds of chops, which are like signatures in China, just to get a major project done. Hundreds. I mean, not and like, you know, this was his first big project, and so, you know, he finally got clearance at the highest levels, and he thought, oh, everything else would fall into place. No, at each level you have these little fiefdoms or little kingdoms, and an official who needs to be wooed and courted and get that chop, you know, that signature. Right, bureau and division chiefs had their own little fiefdoms. Let's see. I think I had, not till 170. Oh yeah, capitalism will liberalize China myth is morally complex, right? So like, you know, a lot of people believed that economic growth would liberalize China, and by all appearances it did through the 90s and 2000s. And so to condemn everybody who is involved in that is really rather silly. Also, you know, increasing the wealth of China did create huge amounts of human good just on the level of basic living for hundreds of millions of people. So anyway, yeah, I think this is important to read here. So about how the liberalizing myth really was BS even from the beginning. Of course, a lot of this is with hindsight. I mean, he was not aware of a lot of this while it was happening. It's just what he knows now looking back. You know, sort of like Hong Kong makes perfect sense looking backwards, right? But 5 years ago, I'd be like, oh my God, you know, eventually it might happen because the CCP is pretty bad, but, you know, is it going to happen in, next year, in 2 years? You know, I would not have. Anyway, hindsight's 20/20, as I say. Okay, for decades, Wang Qishan stood at the center of China's economic reforms. Wang was a longtime follower of Zhu Rongji, the reformist-minded architect of China's economic boom from 1993 to 2003. In 1996, when Zhu was first vice premier in Beijing, Wang led one of China's biggest financial institutions and teamed with Henry Paulson, then the CEO of Goldman Sachs, and later U.S. Treasury Secretary, to list shares from China Telecom on the New York Stock Exchange as part of an American-backed effort to modernize China's moribund financial system and its network of state-owned businesses. I believe this was the first U.S. listing of a Chinese company in the U.S. and started a massive influx of Wall Street money into China. Paulson and others interpreted Wang and Zhu's moves as a way to privatize China's economy, but actually the party's goal, apropos of Dong Ling's worries, was to save the state-owned sector so that it could remain the economic pillar of the party's continued rule. This was one of the many instances where Westerners thought they were helping China evolve toward a more pluralistic society with a freer market, when in reality the party was actually employing Western financial techniques to strengthen its rule. So I think that's quite revealing, and again, hindsight's 20/20, but I mean, I think anyone with that had really studied the CCP and really understood how things worked in China could have seen it at the time. That basically you're propping up state-owned enterprises and strengthening the CCP, enabling it to be powerful enough at one time, which I think is some of the more interesting political revelations in the book. Again, like I said, it's an autobiography. There's a lot of reasons to read it, but I'm focusing here more on the political stuff. Okay, so yeah, this is a must-read. Okay. So, But to me, the most convincing argument for the party's dictatorial lurch remains the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. The party has an almost animal instinct toward repression and control. It's one of the foundational tenets of a Leninist system. Anytime the party can afford to swing toward repression, it will. When Deng Xiaoping took over the mantle of leadership in China in the late 1970s, the state was effectively bankrupt. The economic changes Deng ushered in were driven not by any belief in the tenets of free market capitalism, but by necessity. To survive, the party, the CCP, needed to loosen its grip on the economy. Even under Jiang Zemin in the 1990s, China's state-owned firms were losing buckets of money. So private entrepreneurs like Whitney and me were still crucial, his ex-wife, Whitney and me were still crucial to keep the economy afloat and unemployment down. But after the first term of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao ended in 2008-2009, and decades of double-digit growth, state-run firms stabilized, and the party no longer needed the private sector like it had in the past. Beijing also reformed its tax system, so the central government took a bigger piece of the pie. With these developments, it was no longer essential for the party to relax control over the economy and thus over society. Capitalists became more of a political threat because we were no longer required as an economic savior. The party could again tighten its grip. So to me, that analysis or that review of the facts, I guess you could say, was very revealing in the sense that, I'm sure some CCP members, particularly lower down, did and still do want, individual rights, freedoms, freedom of expression, all that. That for the most part it was, and from the highest levels, it was completely, the economic changes were completely out of necessity because Mao had so destroyed the economy, and the Gang of Four and a whole bunch of things. But the Gang of Four wouldn't have existed without Mao. So effectively, Mao completely destroyed the economy, impoverished the country even worse than it was after World War II and all the other disasters of the last 150, 200 years. And for the CCP to survive, it had to loosen the reins economically. Otherwise, it just would have collapsed. It would have lost legitimacy, and it would have collapsed. And so all the economic stuff was always for the survival of the CCP, not about any real belief in free markets or civil rights, human rights, none of that. So now we get into Hong Kong a little bit, and the I couldn't find it in the book. I had to actually look it up. And now he's talking about, he was as a very wealthy, successful business person. He was a member of what's called the CCPCC, which is the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is a whole group of organizations. There's a conference at the national level, regional levels, what we would call a county, and city level as well. So it's a very hierarchical structure with many councils at many levels. I believe he was a member at the Hong Kong level, or maybe Beijing. Anyway, so let's see here. Okay, so no sooner had the umbrella movement started. The umbrella movement was the beginning of the pushback against the first overt signs of repression by the CCP in Hong Kong about 3 years ago now, 3.5 years ago. So this is the Hong Kong people demonstrating and fighting for freedom of speech, civil rights, human rights, and freedom from the CCP, absolute control over the city. So no sooner had the umbrella movement started with demonstrations in September than we were directed by the CCPCC officials to go to Hong Kong and organize and fund counter demonstrations. Those who had businesses in Hong Kong were told to pay employees to march in support of China's position. On a hot day in October 2014, I participated in one of those counter-protests. So, I knew the CCP had organized the counter-protest, but I didn't know that people were paid to go there and all of that. And here's a man who grew up poor, who was educated in the West. Anyway, he addresses a lot of this. Let's go to the next one. Right, 258. Here we go. So thousands of people from Hong Kong were members of CCPCCs on the national, provincial, city, and county levels. And all of us were being directed to facilitate China's direct meddling in Hong Kong's elections. What amazes me is that none of us ever came out publicly and said, this is what I did and it was wrong, which he has done actually before this book came out. If you think about it, because he admits participating in those counter demonstrations and not standing up for what was right, and he regrets that. Anyway, what amazes me is that none of us ever came out and publicly said, this is what I did and it was wrong. If you think about it, that is deeply troubling, that so many of Hong Kong's people were selling out the territory's future and no one felt enough remorse to say it's time to stop. We were doing China's bidding purely out of self-interest, but it also tells you how much we feared the Chinese Communist Party and the possible repercussions of saying no and speaking out. So, we all went along with a system that we knew was wrong, because to do otherwise would have cost us and everyone around us, including loved ones, their livelihood, freedom, and who knows, even their lives. The price just seemed too high. So, and you can bet that there was some people who stood up, but again, they quickly saw the consequences. I mean, the CCP is ruthless. So, he documents how Xi destroyed collective leadership. He argues that after Mao, the CCP actually entered into a real period of collective leadership where no one person had really total control. So from the death of Mao all the way through to the last few years with Xi, you really had collective leadership, but Xi destroyed that, which, again, I knew that, but having his perspective on it was very interesting. The development of the personality cult. Also, I didn't know that Xi was often called, quote, the chairman of everything, right? Because he's becoming a dictator. He coalesced control around himself over the last 10 years. He talks about how the CCP has a zero-sum culture. So, like, in order to get ahead, somebody else has to suffer. That and that mindset, he believes, has infected all of Chinese culture in a very negative way. I thought that was fascinating. Which of course is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I mean, zero sum is real in a few very specific areas, but for the most part, with human creativity, nothing, all the important things do not need to be zero sum, particularly economic, right? I mean, we can grow the pie. We know that. This is real. It's not make-believe. Zero-sum thinking, in most respects of modern human life, is not reality. Although we could make it reality if enough people believe it. But anyway, zero-sum thinking, very dangerous, very counterproductive. Makes for a very bad world. Then this is worth reading as well. So he's talking about, this is a fake name, Wolfgang, For he names almost everybody, but there's a couple people he does not. He uses code words for, and Wolfgang's one of them. Wolfgang is the grandson, I believe, or maybe I think the grandson of one of the top, one of Mao's top lieutenants. So he's what's called a red blood, right? In America, we have blue bloods. I think England has that too. I'm not sure. Anyway, for like old money, old power, right? In China, it's the CCP version is red bloods, right? So family members of the elite of the CCP, red bloods. Anyway, so on the surface, Wolfgang, was thoroughly Westernized. He spoke perfect English, and his wife was from Taiwan, but he didn't question the system. In fact, he helped to sustain it, sharing his data with the cops and chasing contracts with state security. At the same time, however, Wolfgang had an overseas passport and had invested a good chunk of his wealth abroad. I debated politics with him. "Where does your capital sit?" I asked once, knowing that the bulk of it was outside China. "What kind of passport do you have?" I asked, aware that it wasn't Chinese. For years, Western commentators insisted that people like Wolfgang, who'd been educated overseas, were agents of change in China, that they'd import universal values from the West and push China in a better direction. But people like Wolfgang never saw themselves in that role. His interest was in China's remaining the way it was. That's what made him a very rich man and allowed him to reap the benefits of two systems at once: the freedoms of the West and the managed duopolies of authoritarian China. The more I saw of Wolfgang and others like him, the more I viewed them as highly competent enablers of an increasingly toxic affliction, Chinese communism. In exchange for a pot of gold, they'd sold their souls. Whitney and I, his ex-wife, had played by the rules they and their parents had set, and we'd prospered, but we knew the rules were skewed. Whitney was comfortable staying inside the skewed system. I wanted out. So, anyway, I maybe should have skipped that last paragraph, but his view of Wolfgang is quite revealing. Now, that being said, I do think there's no question that Western influences on China are real and have happened. It's not like Wolfgang represents every wealthy Chinese person, right? I mean Desmond Shum is a case in point, right? I mean he said enough is enough. So I don't think I'm an eternal optimist, but I do hope that China can become a freer, better country, in terms of human rights. I do. I'm cautiously optimistic over the long term. In the short term, and it has. I mean, wealth does bring choices, right? Even if you're under a brutal regime. So, that being said, I think this last paragraph is worth saying. So, okay, now that the Chinese Communist Party has the resources, it's back to showing its true colors. At the same time, I've come to realize that, more than wealth or professional success, basic dignity and human rights are life's most precious gifts. I want to live in a society that shares that ideal, so I've chosen the Western world over China, not only for me, but also for my son. And I'm very sympathetic to that, but I also think, and I hope, that he is, at least privately, supporting and fighting for a freer China as well. I'm sure he is. I mean, he loves Hong Kong, and he was born in Shanghai. I'm quite sure he has a love of China too, or at least the Chinese people. I can understand. If I was a loyal German, as the Nazis rose, I would have fought inside up to a certain point, and then it would be like, time to get out. Everyone I love, all my family, time to get out. things are going downhill fast, and then I would have fought from the outside. You know, the CCP, I kind of view Desmond in that realm, right? I mean, you know, the 90s and 2000s, things were getting better. There was more freedom of speech. There was less centralized control. There was more individual rights. Things were getting better, not just economically, but politically, right? But then around the financial crisis of 2008, things started to turn. And then Xi consolidated power, and things have been getting much worse politically for the last 10 years. You know, unless you think the CCP is this great thing that needs to survive, but I don't. So anyway, and so I think he left around 2017. I'm very sympathetic to that. I think she's dangerous and brutal, and he resides overall. I mean, there, like I said, I know that there are good people in the CCP, but they're not at the top. And if they are, the ones at the top are being very quiet. Overall, the top leadership is brutal. This is a group, the CCP will literally cut you up and sell your parts. Literally. I mean, this is a very evil group. They will think twice about, you know, now if you're a red blood, you might just get thrown in jail, because they do treat different classes of people differently. But, you know, if you're middle class or lower, they won't think twice about killing you if you get in their way, you know. So anyway, I'm very sympathetic to fighting from the outside. I mean, I think China has unfortunately taken a really bad turn the last 10, 12 years, and I'd probably be getting out too, about the time Desmond did. So I'm very sympathetic. But basically, I hope he's still fighting for China as well. I mean, it's great that he lives in England and in a free country, but all the Chinese deserve that too, right? So, in fact, you know, maybe I could be doing more too. You know, I do love Hong Kong. I do love the Chinese people. I do love Chinese culture. So, I should be doing more too. Anyway, I really recommend this if you care about China or the world. Fascinating autobiography. Desmond Shum, Red Roulette. So until next time, happy reading.